Thank you. You may be seated. Pray with me. We call on you, Lord, to lead us and teach us and feed us by the power of your word. Amen. Happened in the fall of my 18th year. I graduated from high school just a few months earlier. But now it was time to go off to college. My mother and father loaded me in my dad's 98 Oldsmobile. And we drove from Bloomington, Illinois, which sits down here in the middle of the state, up to Wheaton, Illinois, which is right up beside Chicago, about 20 miles west of Chicago. I was going to school there, and I knew the whole time we were riding up Interstate 55 or US 66, it's both the same. I knew that once we got up there, they were going to go back home, and I wasn't going with them. And it felt a little different, but it was what was next in life. You know how sometimes you just get caught with what's next in life? Well, that's what was next in life. So they left, and I got started as a student at Wheaton College, and there I remember thinking, I want to do something different than I've done before. I didn't know what that was going to be, and then one of the other guys who'd been there for a couple of years said to me, "Hey, why don't you get on the mission team?" I said, "What's the mission team?" He said, "Oh, there's a school bus that comes outside the dining hall every Sunday morning about 9:30, 10 o'clock. And you get on that school bus, and it's just guys only, but they'll drive you downtown Chicago, down into the Loop, down to a place called the Working Man's Palace." Working Man's Palace was a place where street people went. You could get a room there for 30 cents a night. That was a tough place, the Working Man's Palace. But we, as Wheaton College students, were intent on helping the people down there at the Working Man's Palace. In particular, we were interested in saving their souls. And so there were two things that stick in my mind about the Working Man's Palace. Number one is the smell of the place. It was the smell of stale beer. And it was really stale by Sunday mornings when we got there, because you see, in Chicago in those days, no alcohol was served until afternoon. So the morning was out of bounds for booze. So beer was really, really stale. The other thing that sticks in my mind is the question. Now, the seniors who were part of the mission team taught us new guys the question. Here was the question. We were to say to these unfortunate characters who were living on the streets of Chicago, if you were to die tomorrow, do you know where your soul would spend eternity? Man, that's a pretty pushy question. But I'm 18, so I learned to say it, but I don't like it. I never did like it. I never felt it was really appropriate to just stick yourself into the middle of another person's life at that level at first glance. If you were to die tomorrow, do you know where your soul would spend eternity? Man. So I was uneasy with it, but some of the other guys were really good at it. And I got used to hearing it. I didn't say it very often myself because I didn't like it. But for me, the turning point came at the Working Man's Palace one Sunday morning when I'm down there, and I'm standing talking to a guy here. But one of my associates is behind me talking to another guy. And I hear him say to the guy, if you were to die tomorrow, do you know where your soul would spend eternity? Now, this is a college kid talking to a guy that's probably 4 times his age. I mean, very, very tough characters. And this guy cleared his throat. Now, I didn't turn around, but I knew this was an old man behind me. And he said to this young guy, Sonny, I don't give a damn where my soul is going to spend tomorrow. I'm just concerned about this foot. I glanced down at his foot, and his foot had swollen so much that it had torn the leather of his shoes. That condition is called elephantitis. And once it starts, you can't stop it. Now, I want you to think about how ridiculous the question is, do you know where your soul's going to spend tomorrow? When your foot has swollen so much, it's ripped out of your shoe. Then I want you to think about some of the other guys that were there at the Working Men Palace. One of the things I witnessed almost every Sunday when I went down there was a little girl about this high, running around with a big paper bag. And she'd walk up to these men sitting up against, or standing against telephone poles, or sitting up against buildings, sitting on sheets of cardboard. She'd go up and talk to them, and they'd dig in their pocket, and they'd give her a nickel. Because for a nickel, she would allow them to plunge their hand into that paper bag and pull out this handful of white powder and shove it in their mouths. What in the world was that? I learned quickly. That was a bag full of flour. And these men's stomachs were so ulcerated from cheap booze that the only way they could stop the pain without booze on a Sunday morning was to cover it up with a handful of flour. If you were to die tomorrow, do you know where your soul would spend eternity? Koheleth gave us these words in Ecclesiastes, Francie. I've seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Even so, it appears to me that one of the greatest disservices ever perpetrated in the name of our Lord is a preoccupation with eternity. Trusting Christ's promise that indeed He has gone to prepare a place for all of us, it comes to me that our first priority should not be the destiny of our souls, but the deposit of our lives. Life hereafter is by definition the bailiwick of God. But what we do now, what you do now, what I do now, what we do now is ours to decide. Still, the legacy of Christianity is closely linked to the incessant human pursuit of immortality. From the earliest days of the church, believers have invested an inordinate amount of time stewing over tomorrow. Jesus promised eternity. The disciples fought about it. The apostles wrote about it. And for 2,000 years, theologians have bickered about it. And in the meantime, millions of people have lived and died, never coming to terms with the simple truth that our most lasting legacy rests in the lifestyle we have lived. The late sports writer Red Smith said it when he was called to say a few words during Freddie Corcoran's memorial service. Red Smith said, "Dying is no big deal. Everybody has to do that. Living is the trick. And nobody did that any better than Freddie." Years ago, while I was visiting an advertising agency out in Garden Grove, California, I had a couple of hours to kill, so I had a rental car. And I drove over to take a look at the legendary Crystal Cathedral. Today, the Crystal Cathedral is a Catholic church. But back then, it was in its heyday. Now, though a bit stark for my taste, it was, and many of you have probably seen it, it was an impressive structure. Nonetheless, when I walked through that building, into that sanctuary, I got an immediate lesson in how to capitalize on the human obsession with immortality. You see, every seat and every pane of glass, over 10,000 panes of glass, in the whole place has a little brass plaque on it. Fred Ellis, Dubuque, Iowa. Emily Trudeau, Walla Walla, Washington. Harry Barstow, Clinton, Illinois. Using television as a platform, Robert Schuller garnered individual contributions for every window and every chair in that building, with the promise that the donors' names would be permanently displayed therein. Immortality. Vanity. Vanity. All is vanity. Now, what disturbs me most about all this is the sneaking suspicion that while we are trying to live forever through the power of Christ, we are systematically denying the person of Christ right here, right now. You know, Jesus didn't make his mark by purchasing plaques or commissioning statues or even by naming universities after himself. No, he did it how? He did it by feeding the hungry, healing the sick, and befriending life's losers. I love the way the columnist Sidney Harris put it, Francie. Harris wrote, "Jesus never asked to be worshiped or adored. He asked only to be followed among the poor, the sick, the despised, the outcasts, the tax collectors who were loathed, and the prostitutes who were rejected. It's too hard for most people to follow him, so they ensconce him in heaven, instead substituting piety for imitation and seeking escape from the commandments by selecting only that part of his message they find congenial to their tastes and inclinations." I suspect this is what makes the scene recorded in the 13th chapter of the Gospel of John so powerful. You'll remember it. Jesus has assembled his best friends for a final dinner. And as he watches them banter with one another, his heart fills with compassion and he gets up and leaves them sitting at the table. Shortly, he returns with a basin and a towel, and he begins to wash their feet. Now here we need to remember the strange relationship between the roads of that time and the footwear of that day. The roads were nothing but dirt, raging with dust when things were dry, instant quagmires when the rains came. As for footwear, sandals ruled supreme. Thus, it was quite common among the upper classes to station a servant at the door of their homes with a towel and a basin in order to clean the feet of their guests. But lest we forget, this group who was having dinner with him, they could not afford the luxury of indentured care. They were not upper class. If there was caring to be done among them, it had to come from within. Even so, when Jesus knelt before them, he was giving them a stunning message that he's given us this morning. This faith in the doing, it is more in the doing than in the saying. Talk is cheap. Action is exemplary. And the great moment came when he came to Simon Peter. The impetuous disciple immediately pulled back. He said, "Never, Lord, never shall you wash my feet." He couldn't imagine allowing the Lord to humble himself in his service. But Peter's bravado was extremely short-lived. With a firm eye, Jesus clarified the issue. He said to Peter, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Suddenly, it was all clear to Peter. In that instant, he realized those who serve must allow themselves to be served. In that instant, Peter understood what we need to understand, yea, these 2,000 years later. We need to understand the partnership of caring. It goes both ways. I once heard Matthew Fox, the contemporary mystic, proclaim that those who would know Christ must begin by making contact with suffering. Now, at first, I was taken aback by that remark. You see, I have never been ready to unite pain with faith. I simply do not accept the hackneyed old axiom, no pain, no gain. But that's not the issue to which Fox was alluding. His writing makes very clear he sees no merit in pain and suffering unto themselves. Rather, when Fox refers to making contact with those who suffer, he's pointing toward the nobility that inevitably emerges when people rise above trauma, rise above disease, rise above evil, rise above misfortune to claim an invincible peace with God. Anyhow, no matter what's going on. The issue for Fox and for Jesus as well, as he washed the disciples' feet, was simple and profound. We must lose ourselves to find ourselves. We must deny our self-centeredness to find our nobility. We must rise above all circumstance in our service to others and thereby establish our oneness with him. I suspect many of you remember that fantastic scene from the motion picture, My Fair Lady. It's a classic. We find Henry Higgins, you remember him, has escorted Liza to the races. She's dressed to the nines, and nobody would ever guess she's a street kid from the underside of London. That is, no one would have guessed until she gets so excited about a race that she blurts out, "Come on, Kingston, move your buns!" She was so caught up in what she was doing, she forgot about herself. Want to know what the Lord wants from us? He wants us to get so caught up serving others in his name that we forget about ourselves. It's precisely the challenge Christ was illustrating to the disciples when he washed their feet. He was so concerned about them, he forgot about himself. And of such is the heart of a healthy faith. Daniel Yankelevich made the same point in his book entitled New Rules, Reaching for Self-Fulfillment in a World Turned Upside Down, Francie. He writes, "You do not get in touch with the essence of self solely by looking inward. There is no real me, a tiny homonucleus hidden beneath layers of frozen feelings. You are not the sum of your desires. You do not consist of an aggregate of needs, and your inner growth is not a matter of fulfilling all your potentials. By concentrating day and night on your feelings, potentials, needs, wants, and desires, and by learning to assert them more freely, you do not become a freer, more spontaneous, more creative self. You become a narrower, more isolated one. You don't grow. The more you focus on yourself, the more you shrink. In other words, when we get all caught up worrying about ourselves, we abandon our best future. And so on this fifth Sunday of Lent 2017, I would suggest there is much to be gained, not by denying ourselves, which can really be a form of selfishness, but by intentionally giving ourselves in service to other human beings. Furthermore, I would maintain there are few practices more egocentric than a preoccupation with eternity. Hear this. Eternity belongs to God. It was purchased by Christ. We own it. And by God's grace, we cannot lose it. As we move toward the triumph of Easter, let us trust heaven to him and do our best to be responsible right here in the present. Again, it's Sidney Harris who summarizes this issue. Right? See? Harris says there's only one way to have reverence, no matter what your creed, and that is to love even when you do not like, to give even when you would rather take, to lose yourself in eternity by finding yourself in time. That's the title of this message. To lose yourself in eternity. Let it take care of itself.
find yourself right now, right here in time, whether immortality or nothing awaits us at the end. Religion is but a hollowness and a mask unless we become what we are meant to be right now, right here, in the present moment. And in that light, there is really only one issue before us in 2017 as we step toward Easter, Francie. Question: what difference does Jesus Christ make in your life right now? What difference does Jesus Christ make in the manner in which we are living our lives right now? When we walk into the office tomorrow, what difference will he make? When the family sits down for dinner today or supper tonight, what difference will he make? And when we fill out that 1040 for 2017, what difference will he make? When we make a decision about involvement with feeding the homeless, or helping with Gardeners for God, or sponsoring one of these kids for the summer mission trip, or helping with that sold-out vacation Bible school this summer, what difference will he make through you? What difference does Jesus Christ make in the manner in which we live right now? You see, in the final analysis, this pilgrimage called Christianity is simply a matter of doing our best through the power of God's strength and God's best right now, making the most right now, making the most of trusting the future to Christ. Don't be sitting here this morning brooding over tomorrow. Don't do it. Hand it to him. And so the Lenten image with which I would leave you this morning flows from the pen of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Fancy. He writes, all are architects of fate, working in these walls of time, some with massive deeds and great, some with ornaments of rhyme. Nothing useless is or low. Each thing in its place is best. And what seems but idle show strengthens and supports the rest. Else our lives are incomplete. Standing in these walls of time, broken stairways where the feet stumble as they seek to climb. So build today, then strong and sure, with a firm and ample base. You have that already. And ascending and secure, shall tomorrow find its place. Tomorrow is in his hands. Next Sunday is in his hands. Next year is in his hands. All of tomorrows are in his hands. And we should worry? I think not. We must trust and serve and wash each other's feet. Amen.